Hey everybody, it's Courtney, and I am back with another card using the September 2018 Simon Says stamp card kit. I'm starting off with a piece of Canson watercolor paper here, and this is cut down to slightly bigger than an A2 size card because I'll be taping this down to a board for watercoloring. So I am using my Misty here just because more than likely I'm going to be stamping my images twice. Being the watercolor paper is textured, sometimes you don't get a great impression the first time. I am laying out my images here, and I'll be stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. This is Copic safe and waterproof. And I'm going to be creating somewhat of a scene down below this little mermaid with the coral and the seaweed along the bottom. So I did go ahead and stamp those images twice, and then I will take those little plants. I'm not even sure what they really are, but I'll be moving those across the bottom of the card and each time stamping those twice. I'm not worrying about masking here. I'm not going to go directly over each image. Once I was happy with my placement of all of my images, I went ahead and removed that panel from my Misty, and I'm just using a clipboard here and some washi tape to go ahead and tape that down to my board so that when I add my watercolor, in this case Distress Oxides, my paper won't bend up as I'm watercoloring. I am going to use the Stormy Sky and Tumbled Glass Distress ink that comes in the kit, and I'm also adding in Mermaid Lagoon and Wilted Violet. Watercolor, especially Oxides, dries back a lot. So when you first put your color on there, it's going to look pretty intense, but as it dries, it does lighten up by quite a bit. That's why I added those 2 additional colors in there. I'm just working on my Ranger craft mat here and just smushing that ink down there. I'm starting with clean water, and I'm taking my brush and kind of just going around my mermaid to make sure that it doesn't, when I add my color, it doesn't go over her. I'm going to be Copic coloring her, and then I'll start laying in my color. The Tumbled Glass I ended up barely using. It was just too light, and I knew it would lighten up as it dries even more. Added in the Stormy Sky, again, pretty light, so I pretty much stayed with the Mermaid Lagoon and just a little bit of that Wilted Violet. I am wetting the entire area first with just clean water and then just dropping in my color and just kind of letting it do its own thing. Now I should have done the top of her first because I ended up putting my hand right in the ink there. But again, I'm just going over her, the outline of her. And then if there's any areas that I need to kind of pull that pigment in, I can always do that once I have that pigment on the paper and it's kind of moving around. You can see the areas that you may need to touch up. The Mermaid Lagoon was primarily the color that I ended up using, and it does look really bright as it's wet. I let mine air dry. You can use a heat tool here to kind of speed up the drying process, but I prefer to let mine air dry. Now, if you have any areas that are kind of pooling up on the sides there, you can just take a paper towel and just kind of dab those areas up. I knew that I'd be cutting down my panel, so I wasn't too worried about it. Once everything was dry, I went ahead and removed that from the board, and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. For her skin, I'm using the same combination as I used yesterday, starting out with my E50 and mapping out my darkest areas. I'm using my light source as being in the top right-hand corner because that's the way she's facing. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color and just very lightly going over the very darkest areas, which will be obviously off to the left, underneath her little seashell bathing suit there, and underneath her arm. I'll blend that out with my darkest midtone, which is my E11, and then go in with my E01 and blend that out almost to the very end, just leaving a very small highlight. Now, when you start off with your skin tones, they look a lot darker than they will end up looking once you have all of your colors down. So if you're not getting the perfect blend right now, just keep working at the image itself, the rest of the image, as far as the hair and things like that, because it will change the way the skin looks later on. I added a little bit of R20 to her cheeks. And for her hair, I'm coloring her hair purple. She's a mermaid, so she doesn't have to have realistic hair. I had to kind of think about where I wanted to put my darkest and lightest areas. I'm starting off with my darkest color and just using the very tip of my marker, barely touching the paper. My highlight for her hair is going to be on the very top of her head. So I'm starting with my darkest color a little bit underneath that, flicking up and flicking down, various size flicks. You don't want the flicks to be all the same size, or you're just going to have just a block of dark color there. Then I started with each strand of her hair. You can see that her hair is kind of separated into different strands, and I'm working on those separately, adding my little darkest areas one strand at a time. There are strands that are laying underneath another, and that would create a shadow, so your darkest area would be right there. If they're not, I kind of just laid down color wherever. Her hair is kind of shaped where it's kind of flowing behind her, so keep that in mind to have that highlight there as well. Once my darkest color was laid out, I moved on to my darkest mid-tone color, which is a V06, and extended those flicks out a little bit further. Again, making sure that you leave room for your highlight. You can always go back in and add a little bit more darker color, but once that dark color is there, you can't take it away. So always be very light-handed with your darkest colors, keeping in mind that you need to reserve that highlight. Now you can see once I get down to the bottom of her hair, my marker began spitting out a little bit more ink than I wanted it to. So when you see that happening, take off the other cap, and that'll prevent that from happening, because if I would have kept going, I probably would have ended up with a big blob of ink that came on my card panel. Next, I'll go in with my lightest mid-tone, which is the V04, and extending those flicks out even further, making sure I reserve that highlight on the little strands of hair. I'm not reserving much of a highlight here. It's mostly for that larger strand that kind of sticks out and the top of her hair. My lightest color is the V01, and I'll go ahead and fill in the rest of those areas. Next, we'll move on to her little mermaid tail there. And I'm going to be coloring these with my YG markers, starting off with my YG21 and just mapping out the darkest areas, which will be off to the left and behind her hair, would create a shadow. For the fins, I guess, on the edge of her tail, that would be towards the bottom, would be the darkest area. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color and just basically putting a line here. I'm not putting too much of my dark. Next, I'll go in with my two midtones and kind of flick out that color just a little bit. Where that shadow is, I'm pretty much just putting a line. I'm not worrying about flicking at this point. These colors are pretty similar, so you're not going to get too much of a contrast here, but I'm okay with that. Last, I'll go in with my lightest color and fill in those highlight areas. If you're having a hard time blending that lightest color, try flicking from the opposite direction. So starting off from the right and working your way back into that darker area. For her little seashells, I'm just using two colors here, just putting a little bit of a shadow on the bottom, I guess, of the seashell. For the starfish, again, just using two colors, just adding just a little bit of dimension here. For the coral on the bottom here of the card, I'm going to go in with my R21 as my lightest color, Then realized these areas were so teeny tiny that I didn't want to oversaturate the paper. So I'm just going to go in starting with my darkest color, which is the R35. My darkest areas will be towards the bottom and where these little areas kind of flick out. I don't have any real reason for putting the darkest areas where I did. I just wanted to have a little bit of dimension and a little bit of contrast within it. Next, I'll blend that out with my R43, again, putting some darker areas in random spots. And then last, I'll go in with my R21 and pretty much just go over the entire image. And I did color the other one the same exact way. I won't make you watch that. I'll skip through that. And we'll move on to, I guess this would be like seaweed. And we'll be using the YG93 markers, colored in the entire area with my lightest color, which is the YG93, going in with my YG99 and just adding a little bit of shadow to the base of this plant, as well as the leaves, I guess. I'm not sure if they'd be leaves, but where they're laying over another one would create a shadow. Blending that out with the YG95 and then going back in with my YG93 and covering up that entire area. Again, colored the other two the same exact way. Next, I'll move on to the sand. I'm starting with my E55 here and just basically laying out just a little bit of a strip of color down at the base of my card panel. I'll go in with my E57 and just darken up some of those areas underneath that coral, which is part of the stamp. And just flicking that out on either side, just putting in some random flicks there just to give it a little bit of dimension. Then go back to my E57, blend that out a little bit and go up a little bit the panel. And I'm just going right over the coral, right over the seaweed. And then last, go in with my E53 and blend that up a little bit further. Now I took a white gel pen and fix those areas, those pearls that are in her hair. I kind of went over some of those with that purple and just added a little bit of a highlight right there to her tail. Now you can see right here above her little tail here, my watercolor didn't dry evenly. So I'm just taking a damp paintbrush here and kind of evening that out. And I'll take a Copic marker. This is a B00, but you can pretty much use any color. We use so many colors in the background that it really wouldn't make a difference. In any areas that the color is not immediately touching my image, I just fixed up those areas. Next, I'm taking my embossing bag here, and I'm going to be using the embossing powder that comes in the kit, as well as the embossing ink. And I'm just randomly adding a few of these bubbles. And I think there's 3 in the set. There's 2 single bubbles, and then there's a stamp that has 2 bubbles connected to one another. So I used those in a couple of different areas as well. And I will go ahead and heat set that with that embossing powder. Honestly, I think I wish I would have skipped this step. But once I added this embossing powder, I felt like I needed to probably add a little bit more of it, being it's so much darker than the rest of the card. So what I'll do is I'll end up stamping my sentiment using the same embossing powder. Now this one's a little tricky. If you're kind of new to embossing, you've probably done white, silver, gold, and you can definitely tell when it's heat set, it completely changes. This one, not so much. So make sure that you don't overheat it or else you'll lose some of that sparkle and shine. For my sentiment, I'm going to go ahead. First, I'm going to trim this down. So I'll trim this down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 so that I can have better placement of my sentiment. And I'm using one of the sentiments in the kit here, again, using my embossing bag to make sure that there's no stray embossing powder, and stamping that right above my little seaweed there and using that embossing powder to heat set that. And I tried to clean up some areas with my finger because I didn't have a brush handy, and I ended up smearing the image itself or the sentiment itself. So I just added a little bit more embossing powder there, went ahead and heat set that. Once that was done, I did add a little bit of sparkle to her little seashell bathing suit and the inside of the bubbles. And also my paper was a little bit warped, so I did run that through my embossing machine, or my die cutting machine rather, a few times just to flatten that out before putting that on a card base. But that is it for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and I hope you have a wonderful day.